I've kind of evolved into boxes. I can turn and carve a box like this in a week or so versus, many weeks or months in larger pieces. Um, I have also evolved into these sort of loose fitting boxes. I used to, as we all start out, probably, we make these suction fit boxes and they're a lot of fun to make and you can learn a lot. They're very precision pieces to get them to work well. But really the only people that like them are wood turners, honestly. They're, rather than just going like this and taking your watch or your earrings or your wedding ring or whatever, you have to pick it up, two hands, put one down, take it out, pick the lid back up, and they're just not really used very, very much. So, I don't know if you all got this. I sent it to Ron. It's just a little handout. I'm sure he can fire them out to everybody if that hasn't been done. But I recently spent about a week in Washington, D.C. Well, I did a demo, but I also did a few days of hands-on. We did a lot of carving and coloring. I put this together for that. There's a lot of information in here that we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about carving and coloring and all of that stuff today. We're going to talk about turning a box. But if you're interested, there's all this information in here. And on the last couple pages, I have sort of step-by-step how I make both a suction fit lid box and then how I make these boxes. So kind of all the steps are in there if you're interested. A little bit about wood, and then we'll get started here. When you're making a box, that's the other thing about these suction fit boxes. You can get kiln dried wood, you can get quarter sawn wood, which are all the things that you should do. But in a week or 2 weeks later after you turn them, they can still not fit right. They can either be impossible to get the lid off or they can be too loose, wood moves and it moves differently depending on what environment it's in. So even if it is kiln dried and quarter sawn, all the things that you would want, I would say about 50% of your boxes in a year time that fit perfectly when you made them will not quite fit perfectly, after some time. So these are different because you can make them a little bit loose and, they'll stay that way. I use really boring woods in my boxes because I like to carve and color. So I don't want any knots or any crazy grain or anything like that. For most of them, I still turn some pretty boxes just that have pretty burled wood or something. But for these type of boxes, I really want straight grain quarter sawn. I like the softer hardwoods. Cherry is my preferred wood. It just carves really well. It's hard enough to hold detail, but not so hard that it's difficult to carve. Walnuts like that too, or soft maples like the silver maple, and those are all good. Sycamore. But I just really want kind of straight grain, boring woods, quarter sawn. It'll move much less. And yeah, but you can make boxes virtually out of anything. So I do twice turn them. This is how I start. When I get a nice cherry log in, I'll make just a bunch of these. I'll spend a day making some blanks, and I'll throw these in a bin. I have probably 100 of these or more at home just drying out. And for the purposes of these type boxes, in terms of the lid fit, they don't need to be bone dry. If they sit in there for a few months, they do great. I used to kind of hollow them out a little bit, sort of roughly hollow them out, thinking that would help them dry, which it does, I'm sure, help them dry better. But over time, it kind of limits, depending on how much you hollow it out, it sort of limits what you can do with the shape after that. So I stopped doing that. I really just do a little core in them now. Where am I on? Okay. No, that's fine. I just do a little bit of core just to kind of relieve a little bit of the stress, but I don't worry about making them real, thin enough that, like you would for a twice turned bowl. They're such small blocks of wood, and you got end grain on both sides, so they're really gonna, dry pretty well, pretty quickly. So like for instance, well, I think I only made these a couple months ago, and they would be just fine to turn and finish right now. So obviously, as we move forward here, this is a lot more fun for me and hopefully for you too. If you have questions, just fire away and we'll answer them as we go. And, yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Pretty much. Yeah. So the question is, when I turn a box like this, do I turn a box and carve it and finish it and color it and all that stuff and then move on? For the most part, that's true. I'm going to move these over here. Just, I don't know what's going to come off the lathe here. So yeah, that's all right. For the most part, that's true. Although right now I have 2 or 3 things going on. And sometimes I do a lot of metal work and machining and stuff like that. So I bounce around from one thing to the other often. I don't just turn, I still build some furniture. So yeah, typically I'll get started on a piece, whether it's a turn piece or something else going on in the shop, and then finish it from there. So one thing that's different about turning this type of box versus a suction fit box is most people, including myself, when they're doing those suction fit lids, they'll turn the lid first. And then you kind of fit everything to the lid. You can reverse, the lid when you have the base finished turned or close to finished turned, except for the base. You can put the lid back on and then, fit them all together. That's very limiting, honestly, because you kind of have to pick a shape from the lid itself. And that can be a little bit difficult. You have to really kind of have a design in your head before you get started. For these type of boxes, I turn the base first. And the lid, as you see those in-fitting lids, you really just turn the lid to fit the base. And it kind of frees you up to make different shapes. Obviously, the ones I brought here are kind of shaped similarly, but or at least most of them are. That's not necessarily how the shape that I always make. But, if this was a bigger piece, if this was a bowl, I would recommend for sure returning the tenon on before you put a big piece of dried wood. The tenons are going to go oblong. For boxes like this, particularly in softer woods, this is cherry. These are I have Vicmark chucks and they have a nice dovetail on them. I've never had a problem with a little piece like this coming off the lathe without re-rounding the tenon. Although I would not recommend that for anything of any sort of size. I don't know if you've ever had a piece like that come off the lathe, but I've heard of that happening. So first thing is just to round the blank. The amount of wood coming past your tool is directly related to the diameter of the piece, right? That's how many feet per minute are coming past your tool. These are all smaller pieces, so I tend to turn very fast with these little pieces. Basically, as fast as my lathe will go, about 3,000, roughly in that area. So first, we're just going to round this off. I do tend to use smaller tools for smaller pieces. I like kind of light tools, not big old gouges for these little pieces that I'm working on, but anything will work, really. So first thing I usually do if I'm turning a box like that is kind of look at, I'm going to leave myself a little bit for the base. And then I usually go about 2/5 is where I like that, the peak of that curve to be. That's sort of the phi proportion. I don't get all crazy about that, but roughly in that area is sort of a pleasing shape, at least to my eye. So that's where I'll start to make that sort of the peak of that curve. So I'm just sneaking up on where we're gonna put that curve. And I give myself a base here. Now, some of that vibration, yeah, some of that vibration is because we're way out here on the tool rest. When I'm turning these, one of my boxes here. When you're turning smaller pieces, I think it's real important to have a small tool rest, because then, you know, you're transferring most of the force on the tool down closer to the post than way out here. And that's what that vibration is that you're hearing. Unfortunately, my lathes, I have a 25-inch swing, so the post is too tall for this one. If there is, I'd take it, but it's not critical. Now I'm not gonna go too deep in here, because I still want to keep some of that mass down here to kind of hold it rigid while we're doing the rest of the turning on it. Yeah, I will. That'd be good. Thank you. I'm going to get this piece out of my way here. And so we're kind of finish the rounding out here on this side. What's that? Yeah, a little bit above center. Well, if I'm rolling big beads, yes, I like my tool rest above center. Which really is all we're doing here, is rolling a big bead. This is actually a little bowl gouge. When you're taking big corners off, a bowl gouge is, I'm a big fan of spindle tools when I'm working on spindle wood, which is what this is. This is end grain, the grain's running this way. So I'm a big fan of spindle tools, but when you're really cutting big corners off, that wing on a bowl gouge will allow you to do that. On a spindle gouge, because there's such a shallow gullet here, it'll just kind of get buried in the wood and it'll sort of stop cutting. So when I'm doing these big corners, I usually use this little bowl gouge, but then when I want to refine it, I do switch over to a spindle gouge. We're taking off a lot less wood right now. And you can get a nice, I feel like you get a much nicer cut on when the grain's oriented this way. Easy way to refine that is just with a skew chisel here. I know you all love your skew chisels. And then being that that is end grain, spindle oriented wood, that will, those little ridges, that will sand up in a second. It's not like sanding a bowl where you have end grain, side grain, end grain, side grain. That will sand perfectly. I don't know if you sand in here, if that's something you try to avoid. I'll do some real light sanding just to show you kind of how that works. I usually sand these to about 400 when I'm doing those pieces. You do want to sand a lot slower. What I do believe though, people, I think my philosophy anyway is you want to sand as fast as you can. I know everybody says sand, slow it down when you sand, slow it down when you sand. That's true. But what you really want to try to avoid is where the wood is sort of skating across the sandpaper versus the sandpaper actually cutting. But if you can get it to cut, faster is better, because you will you'll avoid those sort of scratches that, you know, if it's going too slow, it's hard to kind of, it's sort of like the random orbit sander technique. If you're moving a little faster, you will erase a lot of those scratches. Now this is just, I think, 120 grit or something, but you can see with some relatively light sanding, you can get a really nice finish very quickly. So we'll sort of make a simple shape here. One thing, no, I'm just going to get this out of the way so I don't bash my elbow. So this is all end grain here. And I am a big fan of cutting tools, but there's really nothing better on end grain than scrapers, at least in my opinion. So, you know, when you think about end grain flat like this, so all the fibers are running this way. When you're cutting into end grain, you know, we always want to cut, no matter what we're doing, we want to cut with fibers sort of supporting the fibers that we're cutting, right? Everybody kind of understands that theory. When you're cutting in this way, you have fibers above what you're cutting all the time. They're always in support of the fiber that you're cutting. You have fibers on top of it coming down. And so you can get really nice cuts on end grain with scrapers. And a great scraper is a skew chisel. It's just a negative rape scraper when it's held on its side. And where this might look scary cutting into end grain with a tool like this, it's incredibly forgiving, and you almost, you know, it's really, you got to work to get a catch when you're doing this. So I don't know how well the camera will pick this up. I'm just kind of skewing this a little bit so that it's a little bit skewed like this. So the fibers, as they're coming down, they're kind of getting sliced as well as scraped. But I don't know how well that shows up, but that's like 400 sanded piece right there. There's really not much else you need to do with that. So a real light touch with a negative rake scraper or a skew chisel will really take care of end grain well. So the next thing we're going to do is make a shelf for that lid to fit into. This is this is, I think most people would sell them under the name of box scrapers. It's really just a square tool with a tool rest. Yeah. It's really just a square tool. I shouldn't say it's square. I grind mine so that they're a little bit less than 90 degrees so that I can actually get into that corner in there. But it's really just it's got a bevel on two sides, so I can scrape in both directions. Yeah, that brings up. So if you have a negative rake scraper, these all have a slight bevel, probably 5-7 degrees on them, something like that. You don't have to do anything to the top because you've already ground a little bit on the top. But if you have flat scrapers like this, you will often see that when they come from the factory, you'll have a lot of grinding marks on top. You know, if you looked at that edge under a microscope, those grinding marks would really be like gouges. It would almost be like serrated edge at the actual cutting edge. So I do try to flatten my scrapers if I'm not going to make them negative rake. I do flatten them, and I don't spend a lot of time right out of the gate when I get a new tool to sit there and flatten it. But I just have a little diamond hone next to my grinders when I'm sharpening tools. And for these flat scrapers, I'll just spend a minute every time I take it to the grinder. And after a few sharpenings, you kind of have a nice polished edge on top. And that's going to really make a big difference in terms of the sharpness of your scrapers. So I'm going to put that little shelf in here. Now for these tools, you do want to be a little bit higher than center now. If you're right on center, the bottom of the tool, depending on the radius you're turning here, the bottom of your tool can hit. And that kind of pushes you off to the center as you insert. If you're a little bit above, the radius is going away from you, so you have you won't run into that problem. When you're using these tools, you really just want to cut on one edge or the other, not on both. So I have a little corner in here. I wouldn't want to stick this tool in and cut both, cut in and to the side. That's when the tool will start trying to fly around on you. So you either want to cut the bottom this way or from the top that way to the bottom. You don't want to try and cut both sides at the same time. That makes sense. So here I'm cutting straight in, and then when I get to the sort of the crest of the bottom there, I'm stopping. And if I want to cut the bottom cleanly, I'll cut from the bottom to that edge, one or the other. And you can get a pretty clean cut doing it that way. Yeah, we're in good shape there. That really wouldn't need much, if any, sanding at all. So the next part is doing the hollowing. I tend to, as I said, I use scrapers for this for the most part. And I don't know exactly what these are called. I kind of call them horseshoe scrapers. Yeah. I do put a negative rake on them. I feel like they do cut a little more cleanly that way. But I have a whole bunch of sizes of these, from big like this to very small like this. And I just like the way, for boxes anyway, I like the shape of these tools. Carbide tools work really well too. The round cutters kind of mimic sort of the shape of this. But I tend to use these high-speed steel tools. So. In general, you want to kind of cut on center or just a tiny bit above center. And then that's pretty good there. And I tend to use the largest scraper I can for the diameter that I'm working on. And really what that means is the largest round scraper that you have that's a little bit smaller than the diameter that you're turning. If it's the same size or bigger, you'll wind up cutting on more than just a point of the tool. You'll kind of cut on the, and that's when you can get into trouble. You really can get big catches or. The worst injury I've ever had on the lathe was when I was brand new to turning and I was turning a little hollow form like this. And I had a scraper like this and I was down here like this and I got a catch that went here and I could stick my tongue through my cheek and it would come out the outside. Um, so every time I have a scraper, this would probably happen 18 years ago now. Every time I have a scraper like this in my hand, I get this little chill that goes through. So don't do that. The lathe is a very dangerous tool, or it can be. You know, every tool in the shop wants to kill you when you go in there. That's what their sole mission in life is. But most tools can't really do that. They can cut off a finger or a hand or something, which is not good. The lathe can kill you. If you have a big piece of wood on the lathe and it comes flying off on your head, that can really do some serious damage. So I would encourage you all to respect the lathe. I do wear a face mask when I'm turning anything sizable at all. You know, force is mass times acceleration. We can accelerate these pieces very fast, but there's not a lot of mass in a lathe like in a piece like this. So I'm not too worried about something coming off and hurting me. I'm, you know, sure it wouldn't feel good, or you could probably get a little something done. But if I'm turning anything sizable at all or anything that's out of round, I do wear a face mask at home. I'm looking for something here. See where we're at. We got a long way to go, so. It can be difficult to get that little center point out of there, out of the bottom. You know, basically that's not really spinning the exact center. There's nothing really moving past the tool. So a way to do that is kind of get under it a little bit and then kind of rise up right at the center point. You don't want to get right of center because that'll pick up the tool and kind of send it back at you and you can get a big catch. But if you get just directly under it, you can usually get that center out. And I do spend a fair amount of time. I want a nice fair curve on the inside. I don't want any divots in the middle or any high points. I really, when someone kind of feels it, I want that to be a really nice smooth curve. So I'll spend a little bit of time doing that. And to get your smoothest cut in a shape like this, remember the grain's running this way. So when we're cutting this side of the curve, you're going to have supporting grain cutting in this direction. We're cutting around here, and there's always going to be a piece behind the piece that you're cutting from here to here when you're cutting up. From here to here, the supporting grain's going to be in this direction. So you want to cut that way. I don't worry about that when I'm just hollowing these out and getting rid of wood. But for those last final cuts, what really will give you a much cleaner cut is if you kind of cut in this direction from the bottom and in that direction from the top and sort of meet in the middle. Now, I'm usually turning things fairly thick because you know, I'm doing a lot of carving and texturing in them, so like between depending on how deep, and you can tell from some of those pieces, some of the pieces, the carving's 3/8, or I tend to carve in pretty deep relief. But so depending on what I have planned, probably 3/8 to a 1/2 inch, depending. But we're looking pretty good on top, but we're real thick on the bottom there. And I still have quite a ways to go. I'm going to switch to a smaller scraper now. Where we're at now. Yeah. Over time, you can kind of feel that curve. You don't almost, you can feel it with your tool if, you know, when you're coming around those corners, you can kind of feel high spots and low spots for the most part. Fast. Like I do for small pieces, again, you know, it's the circumference. It doesn't matter the RPM really, right? Well, it matters, but um, it's the circumference of this. At 1 RPM, whatever, we're going to get 15 inches going past the tool. If you have a 10-inch bowl, you're going to get, I don't know, 40 inches, 50 inches every RPM that going past the tool. So for small pieces like this, it really makes sense to turn fast. Again, there's less risk of it coming off. If it does come off, there's less harm done. So I tend to turn 25, 3,000 RPMs, at least once I get it round. You know, when I first put it on, it's a little bit wonky. I'll turn it down to get it round. But once it's round, I crank it up. You get a much better finish off the tool. All right, we're almost perfect on depth there. Probably have a little wall thickness to get rid of. Yeah, getting there. Yeah, I would call that good. I do see kind of this curve is a little bit, I feel like it's a little bit high right here when I look at this. It's nice, and then we get a little, so we're gonna fix that. Okay, we'll hit that real quick again. Right, so next thing I would do is completely sand the inside and finish the inside. And if you look at any of my pieces, although they're highly decorated, carved, colored, all that, I like to have some natural wood on all of the pieces that I have. Otherwise, it can kind of look like it's a piece of clay or plastic or something else. So I usually try to keep the base and some elements of the top and the lid. I try to keep them natural, as well as the inside of the vessel. So I will sand everything on the inside here now and finish it. And I usually use lacquer, but I just use brushing lacquer. Brushing lacquer is basically thinned down lacquer. They make it thinner so it doesn't basically dry while you're brushing it. So I take lacquer thinner, which is already thinned lacquer, and then I thin it down about 50% again with lacquer thinner. So this is really, really dilute. I just put it on with a paper towel, and it literally dries next to instantly. Within 10 or 15 seconds, it's dry to the touch. And after a minute, you can put on another coat. I'll put 5 or 6 coats on within a few minutes. And for a decorative box that's not going to have food in it or salt in it or something like that, they last really well. The finish holds up really well. So I'd finish all that, and then we will part this guy off. Mhm. I I am gonna just make sure. Yeah. I usually do make this mark here. I probably, if this was a box I was making to actually finish, I probably wouldn't leave the base quite that thick. Although I do like a little thickness on the base so that they're a little more stable and a little less wobbly when you're using them. But yeah, good to keep an eye on where you're at there. Ouch. I don't completely part these off because I feel like sometimes, these fibers are running this way. So sometimes when they break right at the end there, you can kind of pull fibers out from the end grain, and then you really got to go in there and hollow out essentially from this side. Depending on how much room you left in the base, that they can get pretty thin that way. So I prefer just to cut that last little piece off, and then you don't have that problem. Now, the next thing I'll do is jam chuck this and turn the base. You can hold it in a chuck, uh, you know, but yeah, particularly in woods like this, if you have some harder exotics, sometimes that'll work. Sometimes you can put a little piece of tape around the chuck before you expand it. But in pieces like this, you will almost always get marks on the wood from the chuck. So a jam truck will prevent that. If I have left enough room, sometimes you can just use this piece for the jam chuck. It's a little bit small. So we'll use. Yeah, you lock this thing. Fortunately, I've had that happen before, so I come prepared now. Yeah, it is. Right. I have over the years pretty much switched. There's a little burr on. Not my chuck. I do like these Vicmark chucks, and particularly for boxes. Vicmark calls these shark jaws, these jaws that are kind of extended. I think other manufacturers make them too, but I like the dovetails that they have on all their chucks, whether they're these shark jaws or not. But I like these shark jaws for boxes because they kind of get your hand a little bit farther away from the chuck. And for some of these smaller items like boxes, where you're really working pretty close to the back end, it just kind of helps. I feel like it just sort of gives you a little more room to work. again, if this was a bigger piece, I would re-round that tenon, but not so necessary for these smaller pieces. I have some calipers here somewhere. Probably staring right at me. Here we go. We're going to take a quick measurement here. And then I want this to jam onto this piece, so I'm going to extend this just a little bit, 1/16 of an inch or something. And now, you don't want this back point to touch, right? That's going to catch and throw it up into your eye. You want to go right across the center. And I usually start way wide. So I know I'm wider than I want to be. And then I'll keep kind of moving it in till they touch. And that's about right there. Yeah. This is a beading and parting tool. It's essentially just a big wide parting tool. But I like this tool a lot for spindle grain because I can use it for things like this. It actually can be a little bit of a skew chisel. It's great for making small beads. You can do a lot with this tool once, you know, you get used to it. Now this is where, particularly when I'm doing a demo, this can take 35 tries to get this to fit right. But you do want to take your time and sneak up on it because you want a really tight fit. So I'm going to go with half of this tenon to try to get the fit right. And that way, if I overshoot, we don't have to, yeah, like I just did right there. It's kind of now you know where it's at. Which is between this and that somewhere. Pretty close. It's a pretty shallow groove I have in here, so. I do once in a while. It's got to be pretty close to fitting. It's got to be fairly snug before I'll do that. I have had some of these fly off if you're not careful. And again, it's not a danger thing. It's just you got a piece bouncing around the floor and it gets all marred up. And you can, you can bring the tailstock up for these. I prefer just to make it really tight fitting. That's awfully close. I usually put them on where it's a hammered fit. You have to pound it in to get it to seat. And if you do that, you really won't have to worry about it coming off. And what do you mean exactly by grain direction? No, but when I turned these rough boxes, this is gonna be the lid for this box. These pieces of wood are continuous, so the only thing between this piece and this piece is the amount that I parted off. So I can always get the grain to match up on the lid, from the lid to the top. And I think that's important. It kind of just adds another little nice. I'll make sure that wasn't the problem there. Yeah, that was exactly the problem. It's always demos that this happens. There we go. Yeah. Now, when you put these on, they can be really hard to get off. And this is your best friend when it comes to that. A strap wrench, these can be on really firm, like this will not come off this lathe unless something breaks. But it is equally tough getting this off of this piece of wood. So a strap wrench, and we'll show that here in a second. I'm not sure I'm fully seated there. Pretty close. One thing we want to keep our eye on again is this little guy here. Back to my spindle gouge. Usually like the base to be roughly about 1/3 of the overall diameter. That's tends to be a pleasing sort of proportion. And then we'll do that same little trick with the skew chisel. Again, you'll get a real fine finish here. No little nub. All right. Oh, that would be the end of the base. I would finish this, finish sand this, and put the lacquer on. Now, if you look at a lot of my pieces over there, I'll put a little band on the bottom and a little band on the top. And that's so that I have sort of something to frame my carving. If you're just making a box that has pretty wood in it, that's unnecessary, but that's kind of why I put those there, so I can finish some natural wood on the top and the base and then kind of frame my carving. And I do that both on the base and on the top. There would be really virtually no way to get this off right now without beating on it until it was all damaged. So this really works well. Yeah. That's how tight you can get them to fit, and you're not really going to run the risk of anything flying off on you, even for longer pieces like that. So the next piece would be to do the top. I don't know if this chuck is too small now. So you know that the best chucks hold best when they're almost together, right? Everybody understands that? Right now I kind of have 8 points holding this because the diameter of the jaws on this chuck are much smaller than the diameter of the tenon. So you really just have 2 points digging in for each jaw. That would never be acceptable for a bigger piece or if you're turning a bowl. But in my experience with these pieces, it works just fine. So same thing. We're going to measure this again. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so that I don't overshoot. Starting on the outside, and we're going to work our way in. And that's about where we're at right there. We want a kind of a nice loose fit here. So Whoa. That's good. That's kind of the perfect fit I want there. Nice, not too jiggly, but fairly loose. So I'm going to just give myself a little more room to work. Now, the next thing I like to do is kind of I want the lid, for instance, if this lid was just flat across the top, that would, in my view, would look silly. So I want this curve to kind of continue up into the lid. So I try to just eyeball that as if I was drawing a circle around here, or kind of continue this curve to both parts. And it's looking to me like I want to be kind of right in there or so. So that's where we will part a little bit. We'll move to the inside. All right. That's a really good finish off the tool. Again, that would just take a little bit of light sanding. I'm going to actually try something new here. You'll get to see it first. So if it, not something I recommend at demos, by the way, but if it fails, and I'll let you know what we're talking about here. So normally I would finish the bottom here, part it off, and then I would typically I jam chuck this into another piece. Again, that little piece can be really difficult to get out of here as well. Sometimes I'll drill all the way through this piece right now for the finial. So I'll have a cap on the bottom and then the finial on the top. And what that allows you to do is when you jam chuck this piece in another piece of wood, you have that hole in there. And if you take your compressor and just poosh right in there, it'll pop it out every time. Obviously, we don't have a compressor here, so that makes it a lot harder. And these can get really, you see how I jam chuck them tight. So these little pieces, these little lids can be really difficult getting out of a jam chuck. That little hole in there makes it really simple, no big deal. We don't have that luxury here. So what I'm going to do is turn a little recess in the inside of the lid here. And this could be decorative. Kind of helps lighten up the lid a little bit, but that will give us something to reverse chuck in here. Yeah. So same drill, we're going to part this off now and I'm not used to have the two hands with the. So now we'll see if it was really stupid to try and do this for the first time. Okay. Quarter of an inch. Now my recess is probably a little less than a quarter of an inch. Normally I would mark this, with the top in there, but I think we're pretty close here. Same thing, I'm going back to that little bowl gouge now, so I'm taking off a lot of wood here around the corner. And that would be really difficult with a spindle gouge. All right. Here's a little trick when you're drilling. Number one, I use stubby bits and they're just a little stiffer. They're shorter, so they're a little stiffer, so you won't get kind of that wobbling. The other little trick is to bring your tailstock up, but before you lock it down, slowly rotate in. If you see, there's a little bit of play in these tailstocks, right? They're not machined perfectly, so they will wobble just a little bit in one direction or the other. And if you feed this in before it's locked, it'll kind of find its center. Once you get it started and there's no vibration, then go ahead and lock it down and you'll get a much straighter hole. All right, and there is the lid. Now, do we have another 20 minutes or so to turn a finial or? Okay. Well, I can pass that around. Again, it's not sanded or finished pretty, but you'll get the idea. No. For finials, I like a stronger wood. And if you look on I use almost African blackwood for all of my finials. I love how it looks. It turns incredibly beautifully. It's like glass. And it's really strong. Like I could turn a piece of blackwood 8 or 10 inches unsupported with the tailstock, even this size, If you do it correctly and you kind of support it with your hand as you're turning along, it's just really, really strong wood. So that is my preferred wood, although you can turn finials with anything pretty much. Harder woods are better than softer woods. And the other thing is you want straight grained woods again. You don't want the grain running out of the blank. This piece actually is not perfect, but you can turn a tenon on these. Again, they're so small. I don't worry about that, and I tend not to have any trouble with that. For long finials, like when I'm making Christmas ornaments and things, I will pull the tailstock up until I kind of round out the blank, just so you can hog out a lot of wood a lot quicker with the tailstock there. But we only need about a 1.5 or 2-inch finial for that piece there. So but when I'm turning finials, I like to have, first of all, I just work on the last inch or so at a time. And then once you finish the end here, you sort of can't go back because it will start whipping eccentrically. So you kind of want to leave some bulk up here and sort of work down as you go. And what you can do with is you can kind of support the piece that you're turning with your finger here. And that feels like it might be a little dangerous, but it's really not. You want your tool stock to be fairly close so you can't inadvertently get your finger pinched in between there. But you can turn a long finial that way without any tailstock support. You can hear the difference when it's supported versus unsupported. This is unsupported. And then that's with some finger support there. Now, normally when we turn spindle wood, we want to turn downhill. When I'm turning finials, though, I tend to turn in the other direction because I turn towards the headstock. Really, all the pressure is going into the headstock versus when you're turning this way, you're kind of putting more lateral pressure on the wood, and that can lead to a lot of chatter. And so we'll say maybe roughly somewhere right in there. The other thing about finials is they all tend to grow after you take them off the lathe. So uh, you'll see a lot of work where the finials just sort of look chunky. I don't know if that's just me or not, but um, they tend they tend to need to be smaller than you think they might need to be while you're turning them on this big machine with big tools and all that sort of stuff. Usually a little bit more delicate is preferred. All right. Okay. Now this stuff sands beautifully. Um, I won't. I usually just run through the grits again till about 400. I'm gonna throw a little bit of lacquer on here just to kind of show you how they finish up real quickly, but the finest paper I seem to have here is 180 degrees, so 180 degrees, 180 grit, but you'll kind of see, it'll give you an idea of. I don't, I don't use steel wool very often. Again, this stuff sands so beautifully that it takes just minutes to go through the grits if you have a decent finish off the tool. All right. I have. No, that's all right. This will be fine. I'm just looking for my chuck with that drill bit in it. Yeah, right in front of me. And calipers. Now, the only other thing that's left to do here is to undercut. You know, my lid's domed like this, and right now that's flat. So there would actually be a gap when I stuck that finial on. This is just some little tools I make for this very purpose out of an old Allen wrench. I just have just a point ground on that with a couple of cutting edges, and it allows me to get in there. You have to be a little careful because I need to get rid of a little more. Because there's really not a lot of wood holding this thing on the, so you want a light touch. Yeah, that's a paper towel in here. This is my high-tech finishing regime here. And now literally right now, that's probably dry to the touch. I could pick it up and not get any marks on it, but. So I'll put 3 or 4 coats on. And mind you, that's only sanded to a 180 grit, and I didn't even really take a lot of time doing that, so. It's very, very easy to get a really nice finish on those. All right, is that box around somewhere? Thank you. Yeah, that finial's a little bit long, or the
That was the question I'm gonna have. You have we're talking about the proportions of the box and your curve of 4/5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's that's a good question. And I meant to say that tenon was a little bit longer than how deep my hole is there.
Oh.
But that's a good question. So normally I've made hundreds of these now, so I kind of just sort of know. But what I used to do is literally take a ruler and go, okay, that's way too long. All right, that's way too short. And I would honestly just kind of eyeball it, and you can get a nice proportion. And really, that's where I'm thinking we would end up. And that's about exact, over time, you just sort of develop yeah, there we go. So that's a box. Thank you. I usually use epoxy to put these in versus CA glue. I think epoxy is a little more archival. It lasts a little longer. I think I tend to think CA glue gets a little brittle after so many years, and epoxy is really good gap filling glue too. Most woods don't fill gaps with any sort of strength, like wood glue, CA glue. Epoxy is different in that regard. So like this one is a little bit loose, but with a little bit of epoxy in there, that would be good to go forever. So yeah, that's about it. Any questions you all have? All right. Well, thank you.
All right, let's give a big hand to Jim. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Yeah,
Great
pleasure.
job.